Hey, welcome back. In this video, we're going to go ahead and start to jump into dynamics. We're going to go ahead and start to see how it works, get it working, and play around with it a bit so you can get used to it. Okay? Now we're going to focus on rigid bodies in XSI. So what are rigid bodies? Instead of giving you an explanation, let me actually just show you what it is. And when you see it visually, you'll completely understand what rigid bodies are. Okay? So I'm going to maximize this viewport up here by hitting F12 on the keyboard. Alright, so there's my grid and my scene. And I'm going to go ahead and create something that's going to imitate the surface of a floor or a table. And then I'm going to create a bunch of cubes that are just going to fall with gravity and react with that table realistically. So how do we do that? Sounds complex, but it's not really that complex. XSI allows you to do this pretty easily. So first thing we need to do is create that table or floor surface. So I'll come over here to primitive. I'll go to polygon mesh and I'll go to cube. I'll create a cube here, close the PPG. I'm going to flatten this cube down using the scale tool. That's X on the keyboard. And I'll flatten this down like so. And I'll scale it out like this to make this nice large sort of table surface here that our objects can land on top of. Then I'm going to create the cubes that are going to fall down on this. So I'll go back to primitive, polygon mesh, cube. And I'm going to close the PPG. I want to go ahead and scale this cube down a little bit, so I'll scale it down a bit like so. Okay, and I want it to fall from up here, so I'm going to grab the cube and I'm just going to move it up using V on the keyboard to activate the move tool, and I'll move it up here somewhere and it's going to fall down. Okay, now right now you notice that nothing's happening. We need to create these objects into rigid bodies. That's because by default they are not rigid bodies, so we have to tell XSI take this cube and create it into a rigid body. Do the same for this table surface. So how do we do that? Well, let's select this little cube up here, the block that's going to be falling down with gravity. Let's select that first, okay? So with this cube selected, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go over here to the create menu and I'm going to click on rigid body. And in this sub menu, what I'm interested in is the active rigid body command and the passive rigid body command. So I have to make a decision. What should this cube be? Should it be active or passive? Well, if this cube is going to be moving around, it's going to be falling and it's going to be affected by gravity and hitting anything and bouncing around, you want to make it active. If the object is going to be, say, the ground, a floor, a wall, or a fixed table or something like that that doesn't move, you want to make it passive. So I'll create this cube active, and you notice that it turns yellow and this PPG pops up with tons and tons of parameters for me to control that are going to affect the dynamic simulation. I'll close the PPG. We'll talk about that later. Don't worry about that now. Now this object is active and you can see that it has this yellow wireframe on it. That's because of the collision bounding box that's set up by default to a cube object. Okay, so there it is. So now what I have to do is I have to tell XSI to make this object down here a passive rigid body which can pretend to be a table or a floor for this cube to fall on top of and react with. So I'll select the cube down here, which is the floor. I'll go back to the rigid body menu, and this time I'll choose passive rigid body because this object is not going to be falling or pushed with the wind or anything like that. It's just going to sit in place and work as an obstacle for this object to hit and interact with. Okay? But you notice that we still have a problem. We need gravity in this simulation for it to work. So let's create gravity. Let's go over here to force under the get menu, and you see we have a lot of different forces we can create in XSI. But we're interested in gravity, so we'll select gravity here, and you'll see this icon's created an arrow with the letter G. You'll also notice here under the amplitude in the PPG it's set to 98.1. Very quickly, 98.1 is the value of gravity on Earth. So it's automatically set to imitate the gravity of Earth. Of course, you can lower this or increase it, do whatever you want. I'm going to go ahead and leave it at 98.1 because I'm going to keep the gravity pretty consistent. So I'll close that PPG. Also, doesn't matter where you move the gravity icon to, it's not going to make a difference. Gravity is still going to remain the same. What will make a difference is if you rotate this gravity icon and make that arrow point in another direction. If we point it upwards, for example, gravity will now make things fall upwards, if that makes any sense. So you can create fake effects or anything that you want. By default, it points down the way that gravity would behave on Earth in real life. Okay, so we'll leave that alone. Okay, so now we have three objects here. We have gravity, we have an active object that's going to be affected by the gravity, and then we have this table which is not affected by gravity, but it works as an obstacle. So this object here, when it falls on top of it, it can react realistically. So how do we get this to work? Well, this is where the animation tools down here in the lower part of the interface come into play. We can see we have a timeline here, and then we have some playback controls here, like a fast forward, a skip to the end, skip to the beginning. We also have this play button, play reverse as well. Okay, now we have 100 frames here in the timeline. That's a very small number of frames. But before I get into that, I'm just going to hit play down here and you'll see what happens. When I hit play, the cube falls down with gravity, hits the surface of the object, kind of bounces a couple of times, and it just settles down and sits there. Okay? Let me hit this button here to go back to the first frame of the animation. And the shortcut for that is the home key on the keyboard. The end key takes you to the end of the animation. The home key takes you to the first frame of the animation. Alright? Let me switch from wireframe back to shaded mode. And let me also go back and switch on wireframe on shaded in the shading options, just so it makes things a little bit easier to see. Okay? So let's play that again. If I hit the up arrow key on the keyboard, it'll go ahead and play. And the down arrow key stops. And if you use the left arrow key, it goes backwards in time one frame at a time. And if you use the right arrow key, you go forwards in time one frame at a time. So I'll hit the home key to go back to the first frame of the animation. And if you're not comfortable with the shortcut keys of the keyboard that I just went over, you can always use these playback controls down here. So you can use the play button, the play backwards button. You can use the home here, the first frame button, to go back to the beginning of the animation, and the last frame button to go to the end of the animation. I personally prefer to use shortcut keys on the keyboard as it proves to be faster and more time efficient. Alright, so enough of that. Let's go ahead and come over here and switch from 100 frames to 1000, just so that this is longer. And now when we hit play, you'll notice that the animation takes longer to go through. And this is best for simulations because simulations are based on real time. So the more frames you have, the better you can see your animation. That way it doesn't get cut off. Okay, so if I play this again, you'll see that the cube falls with gravity, hits the surface of the table, and reacts realistically. This is the power of dynamics inside of Softimage XSI. One other thing you might want to do is turn on the loop button here, which will loop the animation over and over again. So if I go ahead and grab this slider here and push it down to, say, I don't know, maybe a couple of hundred frames, and I hit play, it'll play the simulation, and when it gets to the end, it'll go back to the beginning and it'll replay and it'll loop and loop and loop over and over again until you make it stop. Okay? Now, one important thing I want to talk about here is size. In XSI, when it comes to dynamics, size does matter. What does that mean? That means that objects should be modeled and created to their real size counterparts. So if you create a car, make sure that the car in XSI is the same size that it would be in real life. And you're probably wondering, well, how do I do that? How do I know what the size of an object is? So let me just hit the home key to stop the animation and go back to the first frame. I'm going to switch to wireframe so you can see the grid here in XSI. So here's the default grid in XSI. By default in XSI, one of these grid units is equal to 10 centimeters. So from this point here to this point here, which is the width of one of these cubes or one of these grid squares, is equal to 10 centimeters. So two of these grid points or two of these grid squares are going to equal 20 centimeters. Four of them will equal. Edit that conversation out of the video. Edit that conversation out of the video. We're going to start again in 3, 2, 1. So you probably guessed it. If we have 4 grid squares, that's going to equal 40 centimeters. So if you have 100 of these, or 10 of these I should say, you're going to hit 100 centimeters. So that's how that works. That's the default. Of course, you can make it anything that you want it to. Now if we go back to the gravity here and we select it, hit enter on the keyboard to open up its PPG, you notice its amplitude is set to 98.1. This number is based on the assumption that one grid square in exercise equal to 10 centimeters. Of course, you can always change that number and play with those numbers around if you wanted to. My suggestion is, when you're first learning dynamics in XSI, leave it at the default of 98.1 and just work in your scene as if though one of these grid units equal 10 centimeters. It's going to make life a lot easier for you and just make things go a lot smoother. Okay? Okay, so that's how size works in XSI and how it pertains to dynamics in XSI. So remember, there is a direct link between the size of objects and the way that objects behave with dynamics in XSI. Alright, so that's going to do it for this video. Just to recap, we quickly created a very simple basic rigid body simulation here. We got this thing to fall with gravity. We got it to hit the surface of another object and react realistically. Kind of just bounces a couple of times and just lands. And you can see it's a very a light object. It's not very dense at all, based on the way that it's bouncing on top of the table. And those are all things that can be changed in XSI, so you can make something seem like it's really heavy, or make something like a balloon that seems like it's very light and not very dense at all. But we'll get into that in further videos during this tutorial. We have so much to cover in this tutorial, and we're going to be going over a lot of different things and how to control these simulations. But I wanted to go ahead and show you rigid bodies, just throw it right in your face and get you right into it so you can understand what it is, how it works, and the interesting things that you can do with it. Okay, so I'm going to end this video now, and in the next one we'll pick up and we'll continue working with dynamics in XSI.